Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that I introduce my guest, retired professor of history of archaeology and history at the University of Haifa, Adrian Boas. Adrian is the author of a large number of volumes dedicated to archaeological research, particularly of the Crusading period in the Holy Land and Jerusalem. So today we're going to talk about Jerusalem in the time of the Crusades. We're going to step back into a mostly neglected topic, certainly in our podcast, but also we're going to talk about other locations that Professor Boas has excavated in the last few years. Lastly, we're going to talk about something that he has been writing just in recent times. In fact, Professor Boas just published a novel, an historical novel called The Sulphur Priest, a very interesting title, and we will hear also about his future projects. But in the meantime, Adrian, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to participate.
Now, we can't escape the fact that you have a very soft, warm Australian accent. But I must ask, Adrian, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection with the city?
Well, as an observant Jew, I grew up obviously with Jerusalem as something central, more of an abstract Jerusalem, living in Australia, as you mentioned. So Jerusalem was something quite far away. I didn't know all that much about it physically, but I knew Jerusalem from the Bible and Jerusalem from the prayers and from the history books. In 1969, my family emigrated. I was 17. My family immigrated to Israel, and I first saw Jerusalem in the summer of '69, coming up from the desert, from an absorption center in the Negev, via the Dead Sea. And so the first view I had of Jerusalem was coming from the east, from the road from the Dead Sea. So that wonderful panorama of the city and the new city in the background. And so it was a very moving experience for me right from the very beginning, from the first time I actually saw Jerusalem as a physical Jerusalem. Subsequently, I lived in various places more towards the coast. And I remember every time I came up to Jerusalem, it was sort of a spiritual uplifting, a feeling of something very special going up the hill towards the city. It was something that was very moving. And eventually, and so all those years I desired to come and live in Jerusalem. And eventually I did when I got married in 1978. And I've been living mostly in Jerusalem ever since. And today I live 5 minutes from Jaffa Gate by foot. So it's right in the heart of the city. And for me, Jerusalem is a very, it's home. It's an experience living in a city like this. I've lived in London, in Melbourne, in Rome. Jerusalem is different. It has a completely different atmosphere from any other place I've lived in, and it's home for me. So Jerusalem for me is home for the good and the bad, for the beauty and the ugliness. It has everything. I wouldn't live anywhere else.
Let me take you to a different kind of Jerusalem. So you wrote this book, Jerusalem in the Time of the Crusades. Jerusalem was taken by the Crusaders in 1099. I was wondering, how was life back then? How was the the feeling and the groove of the city more than a millennia ago?
Well, it changed over time, of course. So when the Crusader armies arrived in the summer of 1099, after a month and a half managed to occupy the city, it was a very different city. Living in Jerusalem at that time, at the beginning of the 12th century, would have been very, very different from living in Jerusalem, say, 50 years later. because it was an empty city. Most of the population had either fled or been slaughtered, and many of the Crusaders who had taken part in the occupation of the city didn't remain in the city as well. So it was an empty city in the first years and the first few decades. So it was not a city that would be very comfortable to live in. It was under constant threat of marauders coming over the walls and entering the city. There were not enough people to defend the walls. In the medieval sources, we read about people being attacked in their houses within the city. So it was a very difficult city in those early years. By the middle of the century, the picture is entirely different. And that's because obviously Jerusalem was the heart of the Crusader movement. The whole point of the Crusader movement was to recover the Holy Land for Christianity. So there was a major effort made by the leaders to improve the conditions within the city, and a whole series of different acts were carried out in order to increase the population, the Christian population, and to improve the facilities so that people would desire to come here and to live in the city. And this included obviously economic issues of reducing taxes and things like that, but it was also a tremendous amount of building activity, of improving facilities to encourage pilgrims to come to the city. So rebuilding churches, many of which, or most of which, had been destroyed at the beginning of the 11th century, rebuilding the churches, building hostels and hospitals, and commercial centers within the city. And this activity, and fortifying the walls, refortifying the walls as well. So all of this activity resulted in a city which by the middle of the century was fully populated and lively, and with commerce, and with a lot of tremendous amount of pilgrimage entering the city. And so it had gone through this complete change, basically, from the conditions in the early years of the 12th century to the middle of the 12th century. And then it remained more or less an active and developing city until the collapse in 1187, following the Battle of Hattin. And then you have a second period of Jerusalem in the 13th century, which is very little is known about. I wrote an article on this because there's a tendency amongst historians to think that Jerusalem in the 13th century, when it was recovered by Frederick II in 1229 and was held for slightly less than 15 years, was nothing more than a sort of an army camp. And in fact, that's not really the case. And there's evidence of building of new markets and various other construction activity and commercial activity in the city. So and even possibly one of the churches was built in that time. Most of the churches had been built already in the 12th century. So there's also this brief 13th century phase, which is of interest.
I was curious about the population. You talked about, obviously, Jerusalem under the Crusaders was mostly a Christian city. I was wondering if there was any room for Muslims and Jews, or were they completely excluded from the city?
Well, officially they were excluded, but in fact there seems to have been there was a small community of Jews in the area of the citadel, David's citadel at the western side of the city, who were involved in dyeing of cloth, in the dyeing industry. But this might have been extremely small. There's a dispute about the number, because the source is a Hebrew source, and the letter that was used in Hebrew, numbers are given in letters, and the letter that was used could either mean 4 or 200, so which is quite different. But even, you know, at the most 200 people, but much more likely a couple of small number of people of Jews were involved in this industrial activity by what's today Jaffa Gate, or the citadel. And there may possibly have been some Jews and perhaps Muslims in the hospital, in the hospital compound, there are some hints at that. There's nothing that's clear cut, but there are some suggestions that that's a possibility involved in some way, either as patients or as doctors. It's not entirely clear. And there are references to merchants coming into the city, Muslim merchants coming into the city in the 12th century. But officially, it's a Christian city, and only Christians are allowed to reside in it, officially.
And probably we should say only Catholics, right? Because also Orthodox were not necessarily part of the Jerusalem milieu.
Well, no, that's not entirely true. You had not only Latins, but you had Orthodox communities in the city as well. And there was, for example, in what's today the Muslim quarter, and there are various Orthodox churches as well. So there were Orthodox communities, but it was largely a Latin city, a Western Christian city.
I was wondering if you can give us a sense of the landscape of Jerusalem, because nowadays people tend to look at the city through the lenses of the old city and the walls that were essentially built by the Ottomans when they took over in 1517. But obviously Jerusalem in the 12th century was different. It had obviously some of the geographical landmarks that we still know nowadays, particularly the Roman structure, but the walls were not there. So I was wondering if you can paint for us like a map. Obviously, it's very hard on a podcast, but just to get a sense of how the city looked like.
Yes, well, it's to a degree, it's not all that different it was not all that different in the 12th century than what it is today, what the old city constitutes today. So you have the Ottoman walls are founded on the basis of earlier walls in most parts, not entirely, but in most parts. When the Crusaders arrived, the walls had been renewed in the century before, in the 11th century, under the Fatimids, the Egyptians. So you had a reconstruction of the southern wall, which is basically within along most of its length identical or within a few meters distance from the medieval wall. And it seems to have been a renewal of the Hadrian wall, the wall built by the Emperor Hadrian. It's along the same line. So before that, until 1033, the wall extended much further south, and that was destroyed in 1033 by an earthquake. And then this new line was reconstructed, but it appears to follow basically the southern line of Aelia Capitolina. And that's the southern line of the city today. The eastern wall has not really changed at all. And the northern wall is also basically the same, along the same lines. The only thing that changed, perhaps, well, I wouldn't say radically, but it changed somewhat, is the northern part of the western wall from Jaffa Gate and further north, which was extended out in the 11th century to the position it takes today. And you can actually see just along the base of the Ottoman wall, you can see the construction that was the Fatimid construction, which is quite easy to see, actually. So there's not the external outline of the city hasn't changed really. It was the same in the 12th century that it is today, basically, within a few meters. There are minor positions along the walls where it's changed, but on the whole, it's pretty much the same. Within the city, you had the city was divided into quarters, but not quite the same as today. So today you have the Christian quarter in the northwest, the Armenian quarter in the southwest, and you have the Jewish quarter in the southeast, and the Muslim quarter in the northeast. So in the Crusader period, the northeastern quarter, which had formerly been the Jewish quarter, had been largely occupied by Oriental Christians. So that goes back to what we were talking about before. Obviously, around the northwest, around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was entirely Latin, and the rest, and the Armenians was still, as they are today, in the southwest. What's today the Jewish quarter was sort of a mixture of Christian communities. So you have the German community, then you have various other Eastern and Orthodox and Latin communities there. Another feature that's very prominent in the city today, and was prominent then, is of course the Temple Mount. So you have the Temple Mount. It's changed in that the occupation of the Temple Mount in the Crusader period was, you had the Templars living in the southern section in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and a series of very monumental structures built around it. And further to the north, you have the Dome of the Rock, which had been converted into a church and was an Augustinian community, was held by an Augustinian community. The other focus would be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was rebuilt in the 12th century, and is basically what we see today is mostly that 12th century reconstruction of the church, which had been destroyed in the early 11th century under the Fatimids. And another thing which has been retained and still functions today are the markets in the city. Most of the medieval markets are still functioning. So there's actually a lot of elements in Jerusalem that were constructed or converted in the 12th century and are still and still preserve their appearance today. Obviously, a lot of Crusader Jerusalem's vanished. The royal palace that was next to the citadel has gone, and most of the hospital compound, what's today referred to as the Moristan, was destroyed. It was in ruins in the 19th century, and by the 19th century, and in the early 20th century, a lot of it was demolished to build the present day Aftimos market. So a lot of things have vanished, but still Jerusalem retains a lot of these elements of Frankish Jerusalem. You can walk through the city and walk into Crusader market streets that were built in the middle of the 12th century, and you can see the remains of Frankish houses along the streets, often not intact segments or fragments, but they do exist and they can be seen.
You partially responded to my next question, because I was thinking about pilgrims particularly, but also tourists. Often they visit Jerusalem through the lenses of the Bible or religious text anyway. I was wondering if someone would go around Jerusalem trying to find the remnants of Crusader Jerusalem, what would be left? And you already mentioned a number of buildings, and of course also what has have disappeared in time. And I was wondering if there's anything else that might be seen that would connect these visitors to Crusader Jerusalem, whether symbols or, I don't know, public buildings like water fountains, or any kind of visual sort of material.
Well, yes, there are a lot of elements in the city that can be recognized as being Frankish, and some, as an archaeologist, obviously these are the details that you look for. One of the things that's very helpful in studying Crusader archaeology, and it's true about Jerusalem as it's true about many other places, is that the Franks brought with them a number of styles of architecture and manners of constructing buildings that were European and were entirely out of place here in this region prior to the Crusades and after the Crusades. So if you see construction with a particular type of tooling on the stonework, or elements like mason's marks, which are marks incised on the stone in order for the mason to be paid for the amount of stones he's prepared for construction, you can identify if there are enough of them that it's not reuse, but you can actually see a complete structure or a large section of the structure. You can identify it and you can date it to the Crusader period. So, for example, if you walk through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, which, as I mentioned, is largely a 12th century building, you can see this diagonal tooling, which is typical Western European manner of working finishing stonework, and you can see the mason's marks on the stones, and you can see quite clearly that this is a Crusader structure or Frankish structure. Another example, if we're talking about these smaller details, In Jerusalem, on a number of buildings, there are symbols carved on the facade of private dwellings and shops, which are identifiable as symbols of the military orders. And military orders were Crusader foundations of the 12th century, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and later the Teutonic Knights. And you have in Jerusalem, on a number of buildings, the symbol of the Order of the Temple, which is a triangle with an inverted T, or simply a T, an upright T. And you have, which is particularly of interest to me because I've been working for many years with on matters relating to the Teutonic Order, the German military order, which was founded after the fall of Jerusalem. But you can see in Jerusalem a number of buildings where you have the Teutonic symbol, which is a circle with the T, which is actually an OT, Ordo Teutonic. So these symbols identify buildings or shops, often shops, but they can be private dwellings, as properties of the military orders. And it's quite interesting to note that in some cases these properties were later became possessions of Muslim religious institutions, and they became the waqf of different Muslim religious institutions. And you can see the symbols have moved from one religion and one period to another, the same function, but in another, for another community or another religion. For example, the possessions of the Templars became possessions of the Waqf of El-Aqsa. So you have elements like that. Another thing you'll find, remnants of structures that were built, other than I mentioned churches. Obviously, a lot of churches were built in the Crusader period. Many of them are ruins today, but there are the ruins survive. But you also have features. You mentioned water, fountains, things like that. So you have pools that were constructed. Some of them were constructed in the Crusader period. Some of them were simply restored. Perhaps the most interesting one is the pool known today as the Sultan's Pool, outside the north or the southwest of the city. So it's in the Hinnom Valley, which is running along the western side of the city, extending to the south. And what was done there was a wall was constructed across the valley to capture the rainfall, the water that was flowing down. And there may have been a pool at some earlier period, but we have historical sources that describe the construction of this pool in the 12th century by a chap named Germain or Germanicus. So it's a Crusader water reservoir, and there are a number of other reservoirs in the city. And many other minor things, pieces of sections of shops. I mentioned the markets, which are perhaps the most interesting because you have intact market hall, or not market halls, market streets or bazaars constructed in Jerusalem. There's what's known as the Triple Market in the center of the city, which is actually a mid-12th century structure built by Queen Melisende. And to its south, there's another very elaborate and very large market, which is also a Crusader structure, and possibly dating to the 13th century, to that brief interlude in the 13th century when the Franks returned to Jerusalem. And there are other such structures in the city. So and money exchanges and things like that. So yes, there's a lot of Crusader Jerusalem that can be discovered by a traveler, a pilgrim, or just a tourist interested in history.
I must admit my own ignorance. I've seen the symbols that you mentioned many times, particularly the OT of a triangle, but probably because I've seen them mostly around what nowadays would be Christian Quarter. I always thought they were connected to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, but I was
there is a symbol for the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. It's slightly different, but this is quite a simple design of a triangle with an inverted T in it. So it's quite distinct, and it appears in Jerusalem as an ownership mark, as I mentioned, so identifying buildings that belong to the military orders, but appears elsewhere on Templar objects. For example, a a lead token from Aklit, which was a Templar castle, as masons' marks in Montfort, for example, which means that there must have been a Templar mason working with the Teutonic masons in the construction of the castle. In Sidon and many other castles where we know the Templars were located, we find these symbols. So, yeah, and the Teutonic one as well. It's quite interesting to note that it appears in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount, where there are also Templar symbols, on the Street of the Chain, and it also appears in the Armenian Quarter. And these are two areas which appear to have been given by the Emperor Frederick II to the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century when he recovered Jerusalem, and the Templars didn't return to Jerusalem because the Temple Mount remained in Muslim hands. So these properties were handed over to the Teutonic Order, and these symbols appear exactly more or less exactly where we would expect to find them, where the Teutonic Order received properties.
I guess there's always something new to discover in Jerusalem. I wanted to ask you something about people now. We talked about buildings and structure, which obviously accommodated humans and human activities. So who were the people of Crusader Jerusalem? Were all just military, or there's also room for a civilian population? And what did they do?
Well, there was certainly a civilian population. You had, as I mentioned, there you have the military orders on the Temple Mount, and you have the hospitals in the area around south of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you have the leper knights outside of the northwest of the city, outside the walls, the Knights of St. Lazarus. But the rest of the city became populated by certainly by people who were servicing pilgrims, but also by people involved in various commercial activities, by various industrial activities. So you'll have you would have people whose profession was, say, leatherworking, located in the southeast of the city, in what's today the southern part of the Jewish quarter, near the dung gate, and the dung relates to the industry of the leatherworking because animal dung was used for tanning, and you had a large cattle market there, so you had people involved in butchery and furriers, and you had in the west of the city a grain market. You'd probably have mills as well, flour mills, and there were no doubt many of the industries that we find in any other medieval city, whether it's perhaps not glass making, but perhaps jewelry making, ceramics, and various other things. And you certainly had people involved in industries that were related to, or crafts that were related to the pilgrim movement. And the pilgrimage is central to Jerusalem. The revival of Jerusalem from an empty city at the beginning of the 12th century to a fully settled city in the middle of the century was largely due to the efforts made to bring in the pilgrims and to support them when they were in the city. So you have industries relating to that. So, for example, manufacturers of metal works, which might be religious items or souvenirs, crosses and ampulla for holy oil, and we know of their existence from medieval texts, and there were all sorts of people involved in other activities relating to the markets, so producing food. Cooks in the central street in Jerusalem was named Malcuisinat, the street of bad cooking, because apparently that was where sort of junk food was being prepared and sold to pilgrims. So you had cooks there, and that later became known as under the Ayyubids or the Mamluks as the street of the cooks. So it retained that function even after the Crusader period. So yeah, a lot of different industries, and so you'd have regular people. So you have on the one level people involved in religious activities, communities around the churches and in the monasteries, but on the other hand, you have people involved in all these different daily activities that existed in any city in the Middle Ages.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
I was wondering something that is connected to the role of gender. You talked about earlier Queen Melisende, and I also, I want to use the reference of a movie which I know is historically highly problematic and certainly did not really portray Crusader Jerusalem properly, Kingdom of Heaven, but certainly it was very popular and somehow brought back attention to that period of time. As in the movie, it portrays women some sort of with their own power. So I was wondering actually if really women had their own power in the city, if really leaving Western Europe somehow resetted also a little bit, gender roles in Crusader Jerusalem.
Well, I imagine that, there were obviously certain women high up in the higher levels of society who were powerful women, and certainly Melisende is the classical, the ideal example of that. It's very hard to say anything about society as to get into the grits of society and know what the status of a woman was or what children were in the city. Most of what we learn from medieval sources are more very minor issues, quite interesting, but not so much speaking about power, the status of a woman, the strength of a woman in society. More you come across things like, for example, there was in the hospital compound a place where women would leave children because from the poverty, and women who were poor and left their children there to be looked after, and that sort of thing is expressed also in the fall of the city in 1187, when people desiring to leave the city are required to pay a tax in order to leave the city, and the women were given a lesser sum, which maybe hints at something regarding their importance in society. But no, really, to say anything in depth about the position of women in Frankish society, well, you might want to ask somebody more involved in that particular field than an archaeologist. Certainly, as an archaeologist, we do come across evidence of women in cities and even in castles and places like that. And just recently, an excavation in the south of the city, a very beautiful earring was discovered. So there are things like that speak of wealth and things like that. But no, really, it's very hard to say anything about that. Or certainly, I'm not the person to ask about.
Let me ask something still connected to popular culture. I am currently teaching a course on global history of conspiracy theories. And while I normally tackle more contemporary issues, certainly the question of the Templars has left, since the suppression of the order, stories, and some of these stories converted to conspiracy theories, often involving the famous question of the Holy Grail. But my question to you is that, was there a Holy Grail in the first place? I mean, was this even a topic discussed in Crusader Jerusalem, or is just the imagination and the fantasy that emerged after the suppression of the Templars order?
Well, I would say your second suggestion is correct. I don't think so. I mean, what was very prominent in Crusader, in the Latin Kingdom, particularly in the Latin Kingdom, there was a great deal of activity around relics, holy relics, in general. And it became sort of an industry, a very popular industry, and holy relics and religious souvenirs of different types. And that was certainly something that was of interest and was conducted amongst different people at the time. But regarding as for the Holy Grail, I think all these stories that have evolved around the Templars, as you say, they came afterwards, after the movement was dismantled, and I don't think. I mean, you know, people are always wondering about this, but I don't think there's any actual evidence for any activities around the issue of the Holy Grail. I've been asked dozens of times, you know, is there any point in digging under the Temple Mount? Will they find the temple, you know, objects and so forth? And this is, it's not something that I would think was an issue so much under the Crusaders. It's something more that's developed subsequently.
I definitely share your view, but it's true that in popular culture, and again, sometimes because of movies and stories, then the topic resurfaces and it gets its own life, and it becomes even stronger and stronger. But what instead is real, and I was curious if you can perhaps tell us something about, is the amount of graffiti, particularly around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that you can still find, particularly the crosses. And I was wondering if those are connected to the Crusader period, and what do they represent?
Well, I know that there's some recent work being done on these, and they've been examined with some sort of very special photography material and photography equipment, and in an effort to see if they were. You're talking about these crosses that you see as you go down the steps to the Chapel of St. Helena and so forth, and there are literally hundreds of these, and many of them are identical, and they appear to have been done perhaps by one person, you know, rather than by separate pilgrims. And I'm not up to date with what the latest theories are. I know that there are people working on this at the moment. For example, on the eastern wall of the chapel, there are, which you don't usually get up close to, there are a number of these crosses as well, and I know that they were being photographed, and that some new work is being done on this, but I don't myself, I'm not acquainted with what the conclusions were. I tended to, in the past, I mean, I was always taught that, you know, every pilgrim came along and chipped his cross on, and you can see that some of them are individual crosses, and there are some heraldic symbols that were made by individuals, but a lot of them appear to be somebody may have been paid to, you know, to chip them in or something, and you know, they may be sort of a group thing, right? But you do get them outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as well, in other churches and on other buildings in the city. And in many cases, they are individual marks in other places, particularly when you get heraldic marks. For example, in the Chapel of the Last Supper on Mount Zion, where you have a number of heraldic symbols. Usually they're rather later than the Crusader period. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, there are a number of heraldic designs as well. And they would just be regular graffiti. Some of them quite, you know, they worked on them quite a bit and did some very attractive designs, but they appear to be, in those cases, they appear to be actual individual pilgrims.
You also wrote another very important book, The Crusader Word, which is sort of a discussion of the Crusaders and their words. So not just the material, but also, I guess, the mental and to an extent also their presence in the whole of the Holy Land, largely defined, or how defined was by them. And I was wondering if, combining together your work on Jerusalem, but also at large, we can trace some sort of a long-lasting legacy of Crusader presence that goes beyond also the buildings and the castles. In other words, what did they leave behind?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's often this question as of what sort of legacy there is from the Crusades, and it tends, yeah, people tend to think of the Crusades and think of, obviously, of castles and yeah, physical remains. The castles are the most prominent mark in the landscape that reminds us of that period of history. But there are other things, and not all of them have remained as within the Holy Land, but they've spread beyond. And one that comes to mind always for me is the sugar, because everybody knows sugar. Everybody eats sugar, usually to our detriment. And the sugar was the sugar cane existed obviously long before the Crusades. But when the first Crusaders arrived in 1099 on the way down the coast, they came across the sugar cane, and they described the historians that traveled with the Crusades described the sugar cane fields and so forth. And we know from research that's been done over a number of years now of the sugar industry that evolved in the 12th century under the Crusaders, turning a minor sort of household industry that existed beforehand into a full-scale industry with mills and refineries scattered all over well, not all over, but in a lot of areas in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, particularly along the coast, as far south as Tel Aviv. The southernmost sugar mill is in Tel Aviv itself, but all the way up north to Beirut, particularly around the area of Tyre, and also the Jordan Valley from Beit Sham south all the way down to the Dead Sea, and even beyond the Dead Sea in the desert. And the large number of mills that were constructed in the 12th century were the result of this activity was the introduction on a large scale of sugar to the west. And then it moved from the Holy Land to first Cyprus, where also a large, under the Crusader Cyprus, there was a large scale industry, sugar industry, particularly in the southern part of the island. And from there to Sicily, and then eventually to Central America, and spread throughout the world. But the roots of this as an industry and of the awareness or the acquaintance of modern society with sugar can be taken back to this activity in the 12th century, in 12th century Kingdom of Jerusalem. So I think that's one rather interesting example of a heritage from the Crusader period that survived into the modern world. There aren't that many things that we could say. I mean, obviously, knights and castles are no longer relevant to us, to modern life. But sugar is, unfortunately, yes. In the Middle Ages, it was regarded as something that's extremely healthy, and today it's regarded as something that's extremely unhealthy. So the attitudes have changed, but the sugar remains. And so I think that's probably the most colourful, if not the most important, but perhaps it is the most important example of something from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, from the Crusader experience that's continued on into our days. There aren't that many things that we can really say, that we use today or that we relate to today in some fashion that go back to the Crusader period. But sugar does. So there you are.
I was wondering if with the end of the Crusader era, some individuals did stop and eventually settled under new rulers, or did they all leave?
Oh, no, I think certainly there were communities that remained, and a lot of the villages, perhaps not enough work's been done on this, and today with modern DNA, a lot more can be done. But I'm quite sure that if this is done, it would prove that a lot of communities that had been, or Frankish communities that or Eastern Christians living under the Franks, have continued on and have either changed religion and changed language or evolved over time. But also certainly Christian communities living in Israel today, some of them would have their roots, would trace their roots back at least partly to the Crusades, to the Franks. It's hard to say to what degree. There's always been this debate about when the conversion of the Byzantine population, the Christian Byzantine population to Islam, when it reached its peak, and whether it was before the Crusades or after, and there's different views on that. So what happens afterwards is quite interesting, but it requires more research to really say anything of depth on that. I think the possibilities today with DNA perhaps will lead us to more answers in that area.
Yeah, DNA research and all of these websites that give you access to your sort of ancestry are certainly very interesting and fascinating. I mean, I did myself, and I discovered, quite interesting bit of information about where I'm from. So I guess, yeah, it's fascinating from that point of view. But again, problematic. We always need a context to understand what does that mean. Yeah. I just want to take the listeners outside the walls of Jerusalem, a little bit farther north. So your recent work has been focusing recently on the castle of Montfort, which I must admit I visited, and I also found it, again, coming from the north of Italy, where we do have a lot of remains, particularly of that period of time. I come from an area which is very famous because there are plenty of remnants of the Matildic castle, so the period of Matilde di Canossa. So I was not really impressed. But then I realized that actually there are many, like Montfort, that is the place you're working on. And I was wondering what, places like Montfort can tell us about the period of the Crusades. Why are these castles relevant in the history of the region?
Well, I think, and I won't take offense to the fact that you were not impressed by Montfort. I can understand what you're saying. And that, to some degree, relates to what I'm going to say. The whole point of the castles in the Middle East, and it's somewhat different from what happened in Europe over in the Middle Ages and the earlier periods. The situation the Franks found themselves in when they tried to settle in the Holy Land and in the what became the northern states of the Crusades was very problematic from the demographic point of view. They were always a very small minority, and they could muster an army, but they never could muster an army of the size of enemy armies. So they had to find a way to get around that. And it seems that what they did was that they made use of fortresses as a means of retaining a hold on the countryside, even if the enemy comes in and burns the crops and destroys the villages, they're still holding on to these fortresses. And so they retain their hold in the countryside. And this worked to a degree because the Muslim armies were often formed of agriculturalists, farmers, and who didn't want to be away from their farms for terribly long periods of time. So they wouldn't attack a site which was going to hold out for months if they could avoid it, obviously. So the castles were built to give the Franks a presence in the countryside and to retain it, and to use, and they used these fortresses, and even small ones, towers that were scattered all over the landscape, as centers of administration. In the earlier periods, in order to collect taxes from the local farmers, and afterwards to administer their own settlements as well. So the purpose of the fortresses is mainly to have a hold on the land, and to have a place or centers that served as depots to collect taxes and to collect agricultural produce, and to retain their presence there, and less to defend borders, although there were certain castles that had primarily defensive purposes, but they're quite often, or many of the castles were more for the purpose of having a presence that could hold out when being attacked over a long period of time. So Montfort is somewhat an exception in many ways. It's a castle built by the smaller of the three large military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers. The Teutonic Order was founded only after the Third Crusade and the reconquest of Acre. And because it was small and because it was a latecomer, it was under a lot of pressure from the two existing military orders who basically wanted to gobble it up, to overtake to take over its possessions and to control it. And it seems that one of the questions that's often asked about Montfort is why it's located in a place it's located in, which is a very unusual position for a castle on a point in a hill where you actually come down towards the castle if you're coming from the east, which makes it very weak. And why it was built in that particular location. And it seems that it was built there not because it doesn't defend anything. It doesn't defend a road or any farmlands or any settlement or important water source or anything else. It was built there, it seems, because it had certain defensive features, but it was too low down to be really effective from that point of view. But it is hidden by ranges of mountains that basically hide it from the north and the south, and so it was more or less an out of sight, out of mind attitude to, the Templars and the Hospitallers won't see it here. So, I mean, obviously everyone knew it was there, but it sort of seems to be that the idea was just to have it sort of hidden away a bit in the countryside rather than to defend anything. So it's a bit unusual, but most castles are built with more consideration of the strategic importance of the location. But you have castles that were obviously built for defending particular areas. The fortress on north of the Sea of Galilee, Vadomyakov or Chastelet, was built to defend one of the important fords across the Jordan River. And you have castles like Crac de Chevalier in the north defending the Homs Valley, which was a sort of a weak point in the defenses that could have been very effectively used to split the northern states from the southern states. So there are obviously castles that were built with much more understandable defensive purposes than Montfort.
As we reach the end of the interview, I wanted to ask you something about your latest endeavor. So you engage with novel writing with a very fascinating title, The Sulphur Priest. And my understanding, this is a novel that takes the readers back to the Crusader period, but also forth to the Mandate era. So I was wondering, first of all, how did you get to write an historical novel, and what is it all about?
Well, actually, I wrote it about 10 years ago, and I was advised at the time that to leave it until I retire. Academics often are not particularly attracted towards taking historical topics and turning them into fiction. It can be a dangerous area. And that's what I did. And basically, I published it this year after retirement. But I certainly don't regret having written it. In quite the opposite. It's a novel which is largely based on it's partly based on fact. Certainly the part dating to the Mandate period, because it's a novel about Montfort Castle, and it's about two phases. It's about the arrival of certain person to the castle, an imaginary person, to the castle at the time of the siege. And that's part of the story, which is the larger part of the story, is the description of the siege is based on information that I've come across through 15 years of involvement at Montfort. So it's a realistic account of what it probably was like to be in the siege of Montfort in 1271. But of course, the story itself is imagined, yes, as novels are. The other part is also based on a lot of fact, and that is the story about the excavation of Montfort, which took place, the original excavation. We began working at Montfort in 2006, and we began excavating in 2011, I think it was. But in 1926, the Metropolitan Museum of New York sent out a small team to dig at Montfort with the aim of finding a suit of armor, which is a very illogical aim, but in 1926 they were not aware of what happens to iron if it's left in a rainy area for several hundred years. But that was the intention, and the team, tiny little team of 3 or 4 people, and about 50 at the peak workers from the nearby villages, excavated for a month in the spring of 1926, and they excavated a large part of the main buildings of the castle. Unfortunately, it would have been nice if they left it for us to do, but they did quite a lot of work there, removing a lot of the soil, exposing a lot of, and unfortunately destroying a lot of things as well, because the methods were not so great then. But they produced or published a small booklet on the results of the excavation. And what's interesting about the work that they did, and the archaeologist and the person who had organized this excavation did a very good job, very intelligent people, and they did a fine job of discussing daily life in the castle. They gave up on there in the end. It was described as a miserable failure, the aim of the excavation to find suit of armor, which is not surprising, but they did discover a lot of other things. But what interested me when I was collecting material for a book which we published on Montfort, was that I got hold of the archives of that excavation, hundreds of letters and telegrams and things like that. And there was this whole interesting story there of a dispute between the director and his helper, and quite a dramatic little story. And so I embellished that and turned it into something fictional. But once again, I think it gives you a fairly good idea for, if somebody's coming from the point of view of, what it was like to excavate a site under mandate Palestine, they could get a good idea of it from the book. So it's a fiction, but it has a lot of fact mixed in with the fiction.
I guess I was going to ask you, so what's the next project?
Well, that goes back to Australia. I have a photograph on my desk of 2 great uncles who served in Gallipoli in the First World War, and then later one of them went on to fight in northern France, and one ended up with shell shock, and the other one was injured. And so it's a fictional story based on that idea. It's not about them, but it's about a very important episode in Australian history, which is the Gallipoli campaign, and about something about the First World War in general, which has always been a topic that's interested me beyond archaeology and Crusaders.
This was retired Professor Adrian Boas, previously a professor of archaeology and history at the University of Haifa, authors of a large number of volumes dedicated to Crusader archaeology, and obviously also the city of Jerusalem. And lately, he just published the Sulphur Priest, available in bookstores, but more importantly and more conveniently, also on Amazon. And I also want to mention to our listener his website, adrianjboas.com. Adrian, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.